Hi, Paul. How are you today?
Very well, thank you, Simon. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Whereabouts in the world are you today?
I'm coming to you just from outside London, to the south of London, in a county called Surrey, in the UK.
Perfect. I know Surrey very well. My mum lives there. I'm in Tokyo today, and thank you for joining us. You and I have had some collaborations in the past when you were with Cielo as head of M&A. We talked about some mandates in India, in Australia, and Japan. And it's wonderful that we're collaborating now through both the recruitment transaction platform and your own business, Oconic. So yeah, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. First time we've had anyone to talk specifically on RPO, so I think it's going to garner a lot of interest amongst our audience. And if you don't mind, rather than me talk about all your storied achievements in your career, I'm going to hand that over to you. If you could just give us an overview of your kind of career to date in the recruitment sector specifically, with a kind of laser lens, particularly around RPO and M&A, that would be amazing. Let's start with that.
Sure, happy to. So look, 20 plus years in and around the space. I started my career actually at HP Hewlett-Packard in-house as part of their staffing team there, but was fortunate enough to have the experience of leading the client-side implementation of an RPO solution back in the day. That actually gave me exposure to the whole RPO industry. Didn't know anything about it prior, very nascent, of course, as an industry at that time. And I thought, gosh, that's quite interesting because it's quite a complex solution that you're delivering for a client, but it's in a commercial context, and I'm very much a commercial person. So I ended up joining Korn Ferry for a couple of years to effectively be part of the team that set up and scaled their European RPO offering that was, again, nothing at that stage, and then had an opportunity to join the precursor to Cielo. It was a business in the UK called Oconic. The first couple of years there were literally doing everything from implementation, solution design, sales, client account management, nature of a small business when there's only 20 or 30 of you there. That organization grew quite substantially. I spent the best part of a decade setting up and running the business in Asia Pacific. We ended up with around 1,200 people across 12 countries. And for the last couple of years, I took on a new role leading corporate development and M&A globally for Cielo. And we'll talk more about that today, but I left Cielo at the end of October last year, and since that time have been running my own advisory business.
Wonderful. Thank you. And so what's the driver for you to A, leave Cielo at this particular point, and B, start your own business with Oconic?
Sure. So firstly, I've been an angel investor for a number of years in the HCM space, and I wanted to get more involved in that, supporting scaling businesses being one, but also all of my passion and interest that I had in supporting companies to help them achieve their mission through growth in the HCM sector really culminated in building out the business to support organizations in that quest. And primarily we do three things today. One is supporting around growth advisory, so plotting the path from selling beyond your friends and family and building a proper scalable go-to-market model. Supporting around value creation, that is fundraising or thinking about the positioning of the business to help organizations achieve a higher multiple in the market at a point of transaction. And then thirdly is around M&A, and that can be supporting both buy-side M&A needs and also sell-side M&A needs. And that's very much a combination of my interests, my passions, and my experiences from 20 odd years doing this in the space.
Well, you're new into the business with Oconic, but we've already had some really interesting conversations with sell side and other types of businesses, both in Vietnam and Malaysia, kind of my part of the world, if you like, Asia. So really pleased to see that developing for you. Specifically in relation to RPO, though, and you know that space very well, and I have more of a superficial knowledge of how it works, to be perfectly frank. How has it evolved over time to the point where it is now from your perspective?
Yeah, well, it's certainly gone through a few iterations. I mean, if we turn back time some 20 odd years when it initially came to being, it was very much a agency fee arbitrage play. That is to say, organizations were spending a lot on recruitment agency fees. They wanted a better mechanism, so that mechanism was deploying a capability to reduce the need for agencies, do more direct hiring, and therefore reduce fees. That was version 1.0, if you like, of the RPO industry. Over time, it's become a lot more sophisticated. There's been a lot more demand for value added, particularly from enterprise buyers. So consulting capability around talent assessment, employer branding, technology, these are very much standard issue requirements nowadays. There's certainly been a consolidation in terms of buyers. So buyers typically looking for a one or two vendor solution globally rather than potentially point solutions in many different markets around the world. And there's also been at the same time a huge fragmentation of potential alternatives for clients. So not only is RPO in the enterprise sense an option they look at, they also think about contract recruiting solutions if their need is more tactical or short term. They also think about more tech-enabled platform solutions where primarily they're buying for example, technology sourcing capability with a little bit of a human intervention overlap to deliver the outcome. So whilst the traditional RPO industry has to an extent consolidated, and certainly in the enterprise space there's really only a handful of vendors that could serve that need, there has been a huge proliferation of other solutions beyond that to serve clients' needs. So I'd like to say it's got simpler over time. It absolutely has not. Both for the buyer and the vendor, the market continues to get ever more complex and nuanced based around those different needs as well.
Let's just drill down on that a little bit if we can. So in terms of some of the more innovative and creative models that you've seen, can you just give kind of an overview of the types that you've had experience of working with, and which markets, particularly like global markets, are you seeing these kind of more popular seeing?
Yeah, sure. So I think firstly, over the last couple of years, there's been a continued trend towards more total talent type solutions. That is to say RPO, PERM and MSP contingent solutions. It's been a long time coming, primarily because procurement has traditionally owned the MSP capability and the CHRO or head of TA has owned the more permanent capability, but that is coming together. That's one. Secondly, there has been some more, I would say, still nascent experiences of actually building commercial models that are linked to outcomes. That is to say, retention of new hire, if possible, performance of new hire as well. That's still away in the crystal ball in some cases, because actually defining the success criteria of a new hire and understanding the interventions that make the success or not of that individual is very much multifaceted. But we've certainly been party to relationships with customers, more so in Europe, that have wanted us, and we have wanted to put skin in the game around gain share type mechanisms. Of course, not only is that to benefit of the customer, where they're receiving or we're receiving payment for outcome, but also potentially a benefit to the vendor because the potential upside earning is significantly higher. If you think about it from the CEO's point of view, they don't really care about the fact their recruiting budget may be reduced from 1.5 million to 1 million, for example, but they will care about an intervention of a vendor that can help take their revenue up 3-5%, or indeed take their profit up a couple of basis points as well. And of course, the pool of potential revenue to the RPO partner in those contexts is significantly greater. So I'd say it's a lean in this direction. It's certainly not kind of a well-formed path, but I think we can all see there's value in that going into the future.
And the markets that you're seeing this in, like countries, where are these?
Yeah, so I'd say more so in Europe, particularly in the UK. Ironically, in some ways, the US market has typically moved away from this, and it's almost more comfortable with the traditional boxed type transactional offering. But in Europe, I think there's more of a slightly longer term view over how they want to engage with partners and ultimately getting more outcome from that partnership as well.
What about Asia? Anything different coming out of Asia, or it just seems to be a rehash of what you're seeing in, I don't want to say more mature markets, but other markets?
Yeah, I mean, Asia Pacific, of course, is very fragmented in its approach. If you take ANZ, more mature, certainly more Western in its approach to RPO, typically longer term relationships, more commitment to a more strategic outcome. If you look at parts of Southeast Asia, Singapore, for example, again, slightly more progressive take on that. India, same thing. Again, RPO has been relatively well matured in those markets. But if you start getting into components of China, or indeed North Asia, or indeed other parts of Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, for example, done quite a bit of work there, it's still seen as a more transactional, sometimes finite solution. So often when I was in those markets talking about RPO to potential buyers, they were talking about it in terms of RPO projects. So they're seeing it as meeting a finite need to deliver a certain number of hires. It's very much in, out, in a specific time period. So still that diversity in terms of mindset of what RPO means is one factor. And secondly, in some markets, RPO is seen as more of an adjacency to a recruitment agency contingent offering rather than an adjacency to an internal talent acquisition offering.
Yeah, and I wanted to get into that because obviously you have standalone businesses and all they do is RPO, but some of the larger organizations, RPO is just one of a number of service lines that they have, the contracting and permanent recruitment, interim and all the rest of it. How, what sort of internal challenges do you see or are you aware of in terms of, how they fit, work, collaborate, synergize with other service offerings within larger recruitment businesses?
Yeah, I think there's two lenses to this. One is the buyer lens, and from that point of view, some of them are absolutely of the view that pure play RPO vendors are a better solution because there's no internal conflicts of interest and their needs to be directly served from that partner. Others have the view that a more multi-service line business is better insofar as they've potentially got more coverage, more capability, more infrastructure around the world, and they can effectively support some of the RPO delivery with those other capabilities at time. There isn't right or wrong answers to those. It's just people are quite kind of religious in their view over which one they feel is better for their organization. But flipping it to the side of the actual service provider, the benefit of pure play RPO businesses is that it's very clean. Everyone understands exactly what the objectives are, what the business vision is. There's no competing for different service lines or competing for capital or investment internally to grow that component of the business. The drawback is that you don't necessarily have the ability to offer a more holistic offering to a customer and meet those different point needs. So if you're a multi-service line staffing or recruiting business, you could potentially deliver the contingent need, the project need, the RPO need, the contingent worker need, and the MSP need, and potentially some consulting offerings as well. But of course, the context in which you're running that business can be a lot more complex, and getting a purity of relationships with the customer can be difficult. You might have internally multiple MDs or business unit leaders owning that relationship with the customer and creating clarity around the direction and prioritization can be a real challenge. I've worked in both environments, both in the pure play environment with Cielo for over 16 years and prior to that in Corn Ferry. So I get a sense of where it can work well and also where it can present some more challenges too.
Got it. Thank you. So maybe we can now look at it from the buyer lens and the seller lens. And you were head of corporate development, M&A in Cielo, and you would have looked at multiple deals and done deals, over the course of your time there. I'm just curious, particularly, because there's lots of stakeholders in a large organization like Cielo, I can imagine. Stakeholder conversion is never easy in a deal, of size and scale, maybe any deal in the M&A space. But, what challenges specifically did you face, or would any typical corporate face if they're doing M&A in the RPO space? And, how to overcome those, I guess, would be a follow-up to that.
Sure. So I think the first challenge is getting alignment around the M&A strategy. And of course, that needs to link from the corporate strategy. So the corporate strategy needs to define where the business is going, what the priorities are, what the goal is at a future point in time. And of course, the M&A strategy is there to enable certain components of the corporate strategy. And when you're thinking about what the options are, you effectively have the classic build, buy, or borrow. So what are we going to build ourselves? What are we going to borrow through, for example, partnerships? And then what are we going to need to buy, i.e. through M&A? And getting alignment and clarity of which bucket of the corporate strategy is going to be addressed by each of those three capabilities is essential up front, because in a large organization, you can burn a lot of time and energy actually defining that path forward. So getting that clear up front is critical. In Cielo, just to give you an example, we looked at over 1,700 potential M&A targets, and knowing exactly what type of capabilities you're looking to acquire is going to be very important down the line, because people can get very excited by shiny looking objects and wanting to evaluate and explore many different ideas, but that can burn a huge amount of management leadership time if you're not clear on what your criteria is, what your success criteria is as it relates to M&A, and therefore what you're looking at to meet that need. The other thing that's quite interesting, particularly in the context of a business like Cielo that's private equity backed, is that you have different stakeholders with different lenses on those objectives. So if you look at it from a PE perspective, they're typically going to think about it more from the point of view of value add. So how is it going to create strategic value for the overall enterprise? They've probably got more of a spreadsheet type view over it. You've got the CEO that's thinking about how is this going to deliver upon my vision and my objectives overall. And then you may have business unit leaders that may be advocates or detractors for the M&A strategy, depending upon if certain investments are going to support their quest or hinder their quest, or indeed see resources focused elsewhere in the business. So there's an awful lot of competing commitments around that, and getting alignment and clarity of how that links through from the corporate strategy to the M&A strategy to individual business unit strategies is definitely critical. A few other things to think about. One is how you actually structure the M&A delivery within an organization. So is the deal team the same as the integration team? I've seen cases where the deal team want to get a deal done, move it on to integration then want to renegotiate all of the terms that were agreed because they don't want to feel put upon in terms of delivering those integration milestones and objectives. So that's an important point. If it's one team, there's more commitment to the cause going forward. But also it's important to note that the business context is constantly changing and evolving. And if we look about it from the context of a business like Cielo, there may have been a priority, for example, to really grow out consulting capability through M&A. And that may have been the objective that was set 12 months prior. Through that period, the organization may have won a number of consulting clients and almost therefore addressed that consulting capability organically, unexpectedly, and therefore the prioritization around M&A in that area may reduce. So it's constantly evolving. And then the final point really to note here is around the fact that there are macro level trends in the market that will impact the attractiveness otherwise for delivering M&A. That is to say, in strong markets, typically people feel awash with cash, and therefore the desire for M&A is strong. In down markets, then of course that cash can become a little more constrained, and the focus is on investing that available capital more into the internal operations of the business. So again, the desire for M&A may become more limited. That's also definitely a factor in a business like RPO that is still highly cyclical, particularly businesses that focus more on perm. You've got the usual upswings. Of course, we all know what happened post-COVID, and then the normal downswings. And in many ways, managing those upswings and downswings is more difficult in an RPO business because customers tend to feel that the team members that are deploying the service are very much owned by them. So unhooking some of that can take a fair bit of time. That can put quite a bit of stress on the performance of the business, which therefore sees reprioritization of activities like M&A ebb and flow somewhat through the cycle of the business time.
Got it. Thank you. I was blown away by that number that you gave earlier in that explanation. Do you say 1,700 businesses that you would have looked at? That's an incredible number, and I mean, it's a huge long list. So as well as all these stakeholders that you need to kind of like corral and get on board to get it done. If you are going to do M&A versus building it yourself, for example. How that large number of businesses, they came through your own teams, direct approaches to the market. They came through brokers, I guess, and you probably got decks that just would arrive on your desk from proactive sellers. Like, what was the kind of the mix of that to get to
sure.
that?
So the first thing to say is that we approached it almost like you would a BD strategy, a business development strategy. So we went out and literally mapped the market using various tools, ZoomInfo and others that are available there, Crunchbase, PitchBook, etc., to really map out what the landscape looked like for M&A. So that created that long list, if you like. That was then whittled down based on certain criteria in terms of location, size, attributes, capabilities, key service lines of those organizations as well. That was then supplemented by, to your point, brokers, investment bankers that were often bringing speculative opportunities in. Some of them were worthy of a look, some of them weren't, of course, because they were just wanting to consider what was right. And then, of course, internally, there's a lot of, I would say, energy and interest about people sharing ideas for M&A for businesses that I think are interesting. Some of them are very valid, some of them less so. My mate at such and such has this really interesting business of three heads. They're doing something exciting. Let's look at it. Fine, but it's probably not going to move the needle, and it's probably at risk of burning a lot of time. So really been quite clinical about defining what those critical success factors look like, the criteria in terms of size, shape, capabilities, and really whittling down that list was essential. But taking a BD outreach style approach to it is very important, not only because you ensure you cover the market, but also ultimately when you get to the point of wanting to validate a deal with the board or not, you've got to have a pretty good answer over why that is the deal to pursue. And if you don't have a full map of the market and all the other participants and the size and shape and how they fit around it, quite rightly, the board is probably going to tell you to go away and do some more homework. So building that top of funnel down is absolutely essential to achieving the outcome you want.
Yeah, and I recall one of our conversations, and you were very on point in terms of the size of the business, the probable EBIT, the number of runners, the location, and all of that stuff. Which is, I mean, I got the sense that you had a laser focus on certain businesses, and don't bring you anything that's 5 or 10% out of that. Otherwise, we just won't.
Yeah. I mean, you get stuck in the shiny object syndrome, right? If it looks interesting, let's take a look, and before you know it, you've burnt kind of a month of time looking at things which are ultimately never going to get across the line.
So, moving on to the seller side, like from your perspective, what have you seen that's helped make it work from the seller side?
I mean, this is a fascinating experience in human motivations, desires, aspirations, emotions, everything. And the sort of organizations that we were targeting were very broad in terms of the ownership structure. Sometimes they were founder owners. Sometimes they were supported by a professional CEO, leadership team and board. And sometimes they were PE-backed assets, and they were the ones spearheading any sale process. And if you look at it from a founder owner lens, this is their one shot potentially of making themselves wealthy. There's often a lot of personal commitment, blood, sweat and tears that's gone into that, and they will want to make sure that they're considering the deal more from a how is it making me feel, how's it making the team feel as well, how's this going to suit in terms of their future home. If it's more of a professional CEO led business with a professional board, they're going to see it in a more clinical way. They might be a little more aggressive in the way that they're approaching the exit as well. And then if it's PE back, they're literally saying, what is the best opportunity cost of our capital here? Is this investment return going to be greater in point A or point B or point C? And they see it in a very clean sort of financial engineering type mindset. But if I just talk a little bit more about some perspectives on that, what's maybe worked in some contexts as well, and how it's panned out from a seller's point of view. I always ask a seller to consider up front, what is their ideal capital partner? So if you're thinking about it from a business point of view, every organization has an ideal customer profile, the customers that they really think are going to bring value to their organization. So if you flip it and you think about it from a seller's point of view, what's their ideal capital partner? And that's in terms of financial capital. Do they need access to a business that's going to have very deep pockets to enable them to expand and grow and aggressively move into new markets? It can be in terms of human capital. What type of capabilities do they not have in the business today that they're going to want down the line to help support them on their quest? It can be in terms of customer capital. Is there good alignment in terms of the sort of customers that both the buyer and the seller engage with? And of course, cultural capital. Cultural capital, probably most importantly, is this a meeting of minds in terms of, are we going to like each other? Are we going to get on? And that's a real roller coaster of an area to explore. And just sort of focusing on that one a little bit more, really digging into, I guess, the spiritual alignment between a buyer and a seller early on is really, really important, because not only is the seller, particularly in a context of a founder-owner business, considering what's in it for them down the line, but also they probably have some conscience over the team of people that they've built over the years, and they want to make sure it's going to be a good home for those individuals going forward as well. So thinking about what it's going to be like post-transaction, how's the post-merger integration going to work, what's the expectations over who's staying, who's going, what's going to be their role, who are they going to report to, what are going to be their objectives, what are going to be the expectations in terms of what they take on into the future will be very, very significant. Just talking about some sort of factors to be ready for from a seller's point of view. DD, particularly for founder-owner businesses, is a real flashpoint. I mean, these individuals are normally busy, they're running the operation, they're normally in front of customers every day, And all of a sudden, you're then asking them to take on a whole second job in terms of delivering due diligence. Typically, these organizations, if they're on the smaller size, haven't been used to the kind of rigor of data and requests that a bigger business is going to put upon them. So it can create a lot of stress to re-engineer or rework materials that have maybe existed prior. There's also just some definitional things get in the way. I mean revenue, you mean NFI, you mean NFI, I mean GP, etc., etc. So trying to unpack some of that and get alignment on definitions is really, really important as well. And of course, last but not least, that sale process is probably going to happen over quite a few months. And what can often happen is a distraction of due diligence and the sellers having to think about what next, how's this going to fit for me, my team, what's in it for everyone, can really distract them from running the business. And, I've been involved in a number of situations where the business performance of the selling organization was strong. We got into DD. That performance started to plateau or drop because they were distracted and customer focus wasn't there, and maybe some team members got a bit twitchy because priorities were changing, and all of a sudden the performance of the organization from a financial point of view was declining. So actually the deal didn't make sense. The valuations that we were talking about could no longer be supported by the financials that were being delivered. So that's essential, and making sure you're still keeping an eye on running the business, delivering on your plan whilst meeting all the needs of due diligence and thinking about what your future is going to bring is a tall order, a tall ask. But that's really important to make sure you can actually get to the finish line of the deal as well.
Paul, a lot of the comments you made really resonate with me, going back some years to when I started my own business to Recruit Holdings. And it is distracting. It's hard to not go to bed and think about it, wake up in the morning thinking about it. We were talking to this, at that time, $10 billion pre-IPO business. We were a small permanent recruitment business, and it was overwhelming, to be honest. And we were having to internally figure out who we could tell, who we could leverage from a legal point of view, an accounting point of view, a gathering of information point of view. And the whole process took 4 or 5 months. And, and you're right, it can have an impact on the revenues that you're projecting and the pipelines. And I think it's just really, really good to have that very strong foundational kind of relationship with the buy side, so they understand that you are going through those challenges, and they understand it is distracting, and they understand it might have some impact on maybe one quarter's revenue, and they're okay about that because they believe in you. And I think we found an excellent partner with Recruit that would work with us through that. So thanks for sharing that. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into one specific M&A that I know you're involved in part of the world I'm familiar with, China. And that happened, I think, during COVID and everything. But it's a really interesting case study in the making, I think, of what can work and what potentially can go wrong with certain aspects of M&A. So I know it's a bit sensitive, but whatever you feel you can share, Paul, I'm sure we'd all love to listen.
Sure. So the backstory here almost takes us back to sort of 2017, 2018 era, when there was, of course, a lot of foreign direct investment going into China. It was the hot new thing. It had been for a number of years at that stage, and making sure we could serve clients in that market was essential. And of course, we have options over how we do that. Build, buy, borrow are the three, which we talked about earlier. The borrow route really wasn't going to cut it in a strategic market that was very, very important for customers. The build was very difficult. There are a lot of sort of market access issues going into a market like China and being compliant from a legislative point of view and recruitment licenses and everything else. So we really worked out that buy was going to be the option we were going to need to pursue there. So I did a lot of work pretty much on my own at that stage to map out what some acquisition options would look like. Spent a lot of time with bowls of noodles and such like in Shanghai and other places, meeting with organizations, and honed in on one business in particular that we felt could be a good match and would actually give us what we needed at a price point that was accessible as well. Because you'll be aware, back in those times, the price point for assets in China was pretty inflated versus the rest of the world. So we honed in on an organization. We spent a lot of time getting to know each other and going through a bit of an exploration, I would say, in terms of what's possible and what would be viable with them. We needed to move relatively quick on this because we had a number of other customers coming up that had needs. So we sort of moved into a process of LOIs and discussing how we would actually get the deal done. At the same time, Cielo actually went through its own transaction from one private equity partner to another, which meant that we actually had to reignite the deal more than once, because we were kind of ready there with one board, and then we had to get back ready with a new board. So we worked that through. But ultimately, we got to a point where we closed the transaction at the end of February 2020. Now, you will note that interesting timing, because of course in China, everyone had suddenly heard about Wuhan. Everyone had started to hear about this thing called coronavirus. But literally the end of February was on the eve of it spilling into the rest of the world. And I remember when I was preparing the deck for the board in terms of sort of go, no go on the deal, one of the risks I had was COVID. This thing might become a bit of a problem. And little did I know, we would close on the deal. We did pretty much all the negotiation remotely. And I wouldn't actually be able to get there again at all to meet any of the people in the flesh that we'd brought into Cielo. So that had some interesting implications for post-merger integration. We had to do it all remotely. It was also, I'd say, a particular challenge here because the business model of target organization was more of a classic recruiting business, and we had to, of course, do a bit of transformation there to lean more towards something that was RPO. So that required a bit of re-engineering and heavy lifting. So that was challenging doing that remotely, particularly in a high trust, consensus driven environment like China, where obviously building time face to face with people is a great way to actually get things done. So the team were very accommodating, they were very good and very understanding, but it did present some challenges. Ultimately, 2 years down the line, it met its objectives in terms of the business case, but I would say it was an okay outcome rather than a brilliant outcome for two reasons. One of which, the integration period was very, very challenging, and secondly, as we'll all be aware, post-COVID, China hasn't quite been the same as what it was before. The restrictions remained a lot longer. A lot more of the FDI has moved to markets such as India or Southeast Asia. So some of the client white-hot demand that was there in prior years is not quite the same way as it was before. But certainly great learnings for me, great opportunity to do something like that, and certainly interesting timing overall on actually making that transaction happen.
I mean, I think a lot of people on this call who aren't familiar with not living in Hong Kong or China or traveling to this part of the world wouldn't really understand just how serious it was and what the impact of business was. I relocated with my wife and my dog, he's not playing up in the background today, with 3 Japanese salarymen on a full Cathay Pacific plane. I mean, it would have been full. There was just 5 of us on a plane that flew in May 2020 to Haneda in Tokyo. And when we arrived, there was just nothing moving on the carousels at all. We were just met by guys in hazmat suits. It just seems like another universe. But to actually be doing an M&A through all of that, I understand firsthand how difficult that would have been. Impossible to get into China. Impossible for the team there to come out and get involved with meeting the teams in the UK and elsewhere, and so I think it's something you can't predict for as well, right? That type of act of God thing is a bit like Lehman shock, right? I sold my business December 2007, so just before Lehman, really, and no one knew the world was going to change in the way that it did then. So there are these things that can come and impact on business, but outside of these like huge abnormalities, COVID and Lehman shocks and all the rest of it, like typically what advice could you give, particularly in the context of your own experience with RPO, how to make a successful integration? Like what are the key things to avoid failure for that? And then maybe I can link it with a second question, which is, again, from the seller's point of view, if you were to advise a CEO of a RPO business looking to sell, like what are the key things that you would be saying to that person to prepare for this journey and the post-merger integration?
Sure. So a couple of things. Firstly, just to set some context. Of course, sometimes organizations are prepared for sale. Sometimes they get the call about an opportunity to sell. And being ready for that and getting your ducks in a row and being clear on your data and your plans and where you're going up front is essential. Nothing is more, I would say, damaging to a relationship process as unclear information, changes in expectations, greyness where there should be black and white information, etc. And what maybe started off as a positive process between the buyer and seller can start to fall into distrust because it's just not clear from the buyer's point of view over what's really going on and what's really there. So getting your ducks in a row up front is definitely essential. I also think it's important that the sellers have some consideration for integration and asking some questions around how the buyer is going to approach that. And we often think about it from the point of view of what are they going to preserve, what are they going to refine, and what are they going to absorb. So that is to say, what are some capabilities or ways of working from the selling organization that are going to be preserved going forward? What's going to be refined, that is to say, tweaked maybe, and what is going to be absorbed. And I think being upfront on that is essential. If I take go-to-market or sales, that's always the classic one. Being clear on what's the expectation of the brand going forward. Being clear on what's the expectation of the sales processes. Are we going to be expected to move into the target organization, the buyer organization's processes, or are we going to remain autonomous in what we do? Sales technology, are we moving from HubSpot to Salesforce? Let's be upfront about that. Let's be clear. And then, of course, the one that often gets a white hot response: what are we doing around commissions and bonuses? Right? Is that sacred? Is that being preserved, or is that going to be absorbed? Let's be clear about that, because those kind of things can really break trust very, very quickly. If we get into more specifics over, what advice would I have for CEOs thinking about an exit? Firstly, going back to what I was saying earlier around considering what your ideal capital partner looks like in terms of financial. So do you need people with deep pockets that are going to help invest in your growth going forward? Are they committed to that? Is your investment part of their strategic priorities that's really going to see the day of light over the long term? Or is it a bit of a nice to have that they're adding in to the portfolio? Human, are there new assets and capabilities that you need to bring to bear around your organization as a seller that's going to ensure your success? New areas of expertise around marketing, for example, or access to team members in new markets that will enable you to sell to new customers. These are essential examples. And then, of course, customers. Do you actually spiritually align with the sort of customer that you want to engage with? Do you have a view over what a good outcome for those customers is that is broadly the same? And then finally, of course, culture, and we talked about the importance of that earlier. I think it's also important, if you can, to really ask the buyer, what is their M&A strategy? Why are they doing this? Where does it fit within their plans and priorities? And that's essential, because you want to understand, are you going to be at the center of the organization going forward, or are you going to be a bit of a peripheral part over on the side? And that's going to be important when you think about post-merger integration. How critical are you and your teams going to be? Where are you going to fit within the organization? Where are you going to report? And are you going to have a real say at what happens going on down the line?
Love it.
It's also
Can I just...
Sorry, Simon, jump in.
No, I was just going to jump in because I want to understand, and it's a little bit of a left field question, but it came to me that within recruitment, you sometimes see talent acquisition people and line managers, they're interviewing candidates and they don't really have a mandate to fill that role. They're fishing, right? They're getting information on the competitor, on the landscape, and maybe they're just in a tougher market. They just need to be seen to be doing that and feeding information to other parts of the organization. In terms of advising CEOs, like how do you spot that happening in an M&A situation as well, where a firm, not necessarily Cielo, but just anybody really, is just trying to get information. They're not really serious about doing it and avoiding going through this long, complicated process, thinking that there's a real buyer here who's showing genuine interest, when really all they're doing is just digging for information which will help them maybe figure out an organic strategy, or perhaps will solidify a buy or not buy decision with a third party that the seller's not even aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two approaches here. One is you as a seller being quite diagnostic in your questions to the buyer. So back to the point I was making earlier, why are they doing this? Where is it going to fit? If they don't do it, where is it going to create issues for them down the line? So really testing them in terms of the extent to which they've thought this through and understanding why a buy strategy here is their choice as opposed to the build. To your point, we want to make sure there's no corporate espionage going on. But secondly, I think as a seller, you could be quite clinical in the way that you define the process. So what I've seen some sellers do is they'll put together a basic IM, a basic information memorandum. They'll share that and say, here's the information. Let us know. We'll have a call with management. After that call with management, we're either going to expect an IOI from you or let's move on. So they're being quite time bound in terms of how they are approaching that. That's very much the approach that an investment bank or M&A advisor would take, and they'll typically support it with a process letter with defined timeframes and everything else. And you can be pretty sure that if they're not kind of coming to the party after that IM and that meeting with management, then it's probably time just to move on. Certainly, I'd say less experienced sellers can get hoodwinked into the excitement of, oh, someone's wanting to buy me. Isn't this great? It's very much a badge of honor in some ways, but it can be a huge time burn. And if you actually are taking the time to set your stage up, providing that IM, providing some expectations on time frame, you can actually look more confident to a seller, because you are creating the perception, at least, that this is something that happens regularly. You're professional in the way you're approaching it. You're managing it to a process, and you're wanting to get an outcome, either positive or negative, from that intervention.
I think if the seller is being represented by a broker, a credible broker, they would be guiding them, and they'd be doing their own due diligence to make sure the buyer was serious anyway. So maybe just talk a little bit on that if you can. You must have had experience of dealing with brokers at a global level. I mean, we worked before. What does good look like for you when you work with a M&A advisory partner?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a very broad swathe of different options out there. So there can be some very large investment banks that are representing some human capital or recruitment assets as a very small part of what they do. And then there's others that are absolutely expert in the sector. And both the pluses and minuses, I would say, if you're in more of a specialist area, they're bringing a lot more insight and advice and context over why this deal would potentially make sense and why it would be worth pursuing. They'll definitely provide more context around the market. They can also, if they're mature and experienced in understanding the industry, be more objective in how they're representing the potential organisation which they're looking to sell, because it's all too easy for a broker to oversell the asset, for want of a better word, and present the hockey stick of revenue into the future and everything being wonderful. But it takes about 30 seconds in due diligence for that thesis to come crashing down. So them being a bit more balanced up front over the strengths and weaknesses of a potential organisation that you're looking to come together with is essential. Of course, if they've got the benefit of knowing you as a potential buyer and understanding your M&A strategy and understanding culturally what you're like, they can be much more effective at that matching process. I would say some of the things to watch out for is around data. Typically, my experience working with a larger investment bank, they will give you all the data you could ever possibly need about an organisation, but they won't give you much insight. The smaller organisations typically would be offering less data, partly maybe because the assets that they're representing are smaller, but they'll be offering you a lot more insight. So really getting comfortable with both those approaches and making sure you're getting what you need to ultimately, as a buyer, pursue the deal forward, be able to bring it to the board and get the decision that you need is essential.
Love that. Super helpful. Maybe we could sort of get towards the end of this conversation, but the future for RPO, like where are we right now and where is it going? Like, can you almost imagine what it will look like 3-5 years from now? What's in the influence of technology, AI, different models? Like, what are you seeing? What are you expecting to see?
Sure. So I think the first thing I'll say is I'm not going to say much about AI just because I think that's going to diffuse through everything that we do across society. So that is a given that's going to support some direction of travel. But I think some structural things related specifically to the RPO market. One, at least in the enterprise space, there has to be some more consolidation. It's still the case that after more than 20 years, no vendor has more than 15% market share. So for a pretty mature sector now, that's surprising, and there'll definitely be some more consolidation in that direction. Also, differentiation. So as I talked about earlier, the enterprise type offerings are now pretty mature. There's only a few vendors that can really serve that need. But for the mid-enterprise or into the sort of SMB segment, there's a huge diffusion of options which customers could think about, not only RPO, but also embedded talent partners, contract recruiters, tech-enabled platforms, and everything else that comes with that as well. There's definitely more of a shift towards RPOs building more platform as a service type offerings. That is to say, a tech first led offering with a people wrap rather than a people led offering with a bit of tech in the background that has historically been the case. And then in some instances of high volume hiring and maybe less complex organizations, the vendors are actually being able to offer something that is almost a tech process end to end with a bit of customer service support, and recruiters are still there somewhere, but they're more there to enable an effective outcome, enable effective experience, enable an effective process than actually doing the recruiting day to day. So that will definitely be a trend that continues. We talked earlier about total talent and the coming together of RPO and MSP. It's been a long time coming, but we're certainly seeing more of that. And I think everyone agrees that just makes perfect logical sense. And with the increased trend towards contingent workers, fractional workers, interims, etc., there's a need just to think more holistically about the workforce. And then probably most empowering and most exciting of all, there will be new entrants, new ideas, new substitutes that come into the market, and the definition of RPO and what it means and the options that are available to buyers will continue to proliferate. And to me, that's something that excites me about the industry. I mean, it looked pretty mature 15 odd years ago, and it's anything but now, because there's been all these new ideas, new concepts, new technologies, and new businesses that have popped up to serve needs. And I'm very confident it will be the same in another 15 or 20 years down the line as well.
Can I just try and tie you down on a few definitions? Just RPO, MSP, RAS, where's the overlap? How are they different?
Yeah, sure. So RPO, Recruitment Process Outsourcing, is traditionally permanent recruitment. That's sort of the box in which that fits. MSP, Managed Service Providers, is traditionally the contingent workers box. So rather than a vendor placing one contingent worker, it's about managing that through a holistic process through one vendor. And then PaaS, or Platform as a Service, this is more about a tech-first offering that is enabled by people. So you may think about the way in which you are, just going to take a random example here, buy flight tickets, right? All of that is now done online. It's a Platform as a Service. You wouldn't go into a travel agent anymore. It's delivered first and foremost through a digital platform, and elements of recruiting are certainly moving in that direction. And we can see that in other components of the HRO, the human resources outsourcing sector. If we think about payroll as was, you usually had a team of 30 people sitting in an office somewhere doing payroll. That's all now being displaced by technology, and the likes of ADP are primarily tech first businesses. So that trend is something that is proliferating into the MSP and RPO market, and will create more of a Platform as a Service type offering for customers going forward.
Love it. You talked about consolidation. Do you have a sense of, globally where that consolidation needs to happen? Where do you expect M&A activity to be in the coming years?
I mean, more than 50% of the RPO market by a long stretch is in North America, and that market is quite mature in the enterprise space. And then there's a long tail of sort of 30 million to 20 million NFI type RPO businesses. And I have no doubt that some of them will find homes in bigger organizations. Indeed, that has happened quite a bit over the last couple of years. And if you look into parts of Europe, particularly continental Europe, or if you look into Asia in particular, there is a large proliferation of businesses that do RPO type activity. And I think that will definitely be ripe for a bit of a roll up over time, not least because, of course, you need scale to actually execute in some of those markets effectively. So I would say North America, you'll see a bit of bottom up type M&A and acquisitions, creating some consolidation. In parts of Europe and Asia, and indeed Latin America as well, though that's a smaller market, you'll see some more bolt-on plays to create reach, geographical reach, and new capabilities into new markets as well.
Love it. Thank you, Paul. Really, really enjoyed our conversation. We'll put this out on LinkedIn. Podcast will go out to quite a big community we have of buyers and sellers and influencers in the recruitment and staffing space. We'll put it out on Spotify as well, so I'm sure we'll get a lot of attention. But just in terms of people being able to find you, how do they do that?
Sure, yeah. So LinkedIn is always a good place to find me, or you can email me directly. Take a look at my website, oconic.com, and my email is just paul@oconic.com. So love to hear from anyone. Feedback, welcome for sure.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. Have a wonderful day in Surrey. I'll be over there myself in a few months and look forward to catching up in person if we can make that happen.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. Nice to see you.
Likewise.